Think we're connecting, so give us a second. Okay. All right. I think we're live. We are live. Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast live stream collab with The Disagreement. I'm Meghan Daum, you know that. I'm here with Alex Grodd and Ben Fawkes. And Alex, you and I spoke on the podcast a couple of weeks ago about a subject about which I knew nothing, which is sports betting. And now I know a lot more, but still not enough. And the occasion for that conversation was an episode you did on your podcast, The Disagreement, with Ben and one other guest. So we have a lot of people joining us. That's great. We've already got 35 people. People are coming in really quickly. So amazing. I wonder if they're going to be betting on sports while they're doing this.
Yeah. Well, it's very easy to do, so I'm sure
Okay.
You
Luke Lamangelo says, "I love you, Ben." Can you see the questions, you guys? Are you able to see those? Okay. Luke Lamangelo, I love you, Ben. Are you the brother of Arangelo? You know Lamangelo and Arangelo? Oh yeah, that was famous. Never mind those. Anyone who gets that reference, come sit with me. Okay.
Ben is very young, by the way.
Ben is very young. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. I got a birthday coming up. It's getting close to a 4 there, so not that young anymore.
Not that young. Okay.
All right. Well, okay. Well, so why don't we start? Let's talk about how your conversation went on the disagreement. Can you? Well, why don't you talk just for a quick second about sort of the premise of the discussion? You had another guest, so there were 3 of you, and the other guest was pretty worried about sports betting. And likening it to, sort of almost like the opioid epidemic. And I know you have similar concerns, Alex, but yes. Can you just talk about that conversation briefly? And then I want to ask about the response to it.
Yes. So basically, I have a younger brother who is in his mid-30s, and I noticed this trend over the last 3 or 4 years of more and more of his friends, his broader friend group, spending more and more of their time and energy and social, their whole social culture started to revolve around sports betting. And it was I sensed that something was off. I didn't have, I was a very casual sports bettor. So I wanted, about a year ago, before we had even launched, this was one of the topics I really wanted to do to learn more about. And what happened was, it was the first, we've now done 23 topics where we found experts on both sides of an issue. This was the first topic. We spent 4 months and couldn't find a single person from the industry to represent the sports betting industry, to advocate for it and defend it. So it was one of those weird moments where I was like, oh my God, there is something weird going on. There was this nobody talks about Fight Club vibe to the whole thing. And from that moment on, I became hooked. But the problem was we reached out to everyone. And then obviously the beautiful redemptive ending is we ended up getting Ben, who is amazing. But over the course of almost a year, we reached out to all the major sports books, FanDuel, DraftKings, all of their executives. We their whole executive suites. We reached out to the gambling lobby, because they're lobbyists. They should want to come on and sort of defend the industry. Crickets. The entire sports industrial complex, which is now in bed with the betting industry. Anyway, long story short, eventually we found Ben. He was the first person after probably 250 different outreaches who said, yes, I will come on.
And don't take it personally, Ben. You were 250
I was going to say, this is making me feel great.
List.
You sure it wasn't 350? It was only 250?
I have no idea. The point is, to be clear, though, Ben did not come on to defend the industry. Ben was clearly a thoughtful sort of insider who's willing to, have a nuanced position that was able to sort of thread some needles and have sort of thoughtful support for the industry. So that was how we set it up. And yeah, I mean, the quick thing I will say is I think this is one of the most consequential and under discussed topics in our culture. I really think that, and deeply believe, I don't know whether I'd put the over under around opioid epidemic. I don't know if I'd take the under or the over the course of 7 years, but there's something really wrong going on right now. And so happy to be here to talk about it and appreciate what I've learned from Ben. I've learned a ton from him.
So Ben, what was and is your relationship to this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd say so I grew up in Brooklyn, and I think you're always kind of around sports betting in a way. And there were, through my club soccer team growing up, right, there's an NFL pool, right, a picks pool, and you pick one game against a spread every week, and it's $5, and it's not, not too big a deal. I think for me, kind of being introduced to sports betting, I viewed it kind of as a different prism through which to view sports. And much like, Plato's cave or something else, kind of once you see it that way, it's tough to go back to talk radio and just like, who should win, the Eagles or the Steelers? Who's better, LeBron or KD or Jordan or all these things. So for me, a lot of the kind of interest in it was, I guess, what I'd call almost like, I was telling Alex, I kind of separated into what I call soft gambling news and hard gambling news. Soft gambling news to me is just, who's the NFL MVP right now, right? Who's leading the odds? It's Josh Allen. He's the odds-on favorite. That's something that's just an interesting nugget, makes you potentially smarter to have a discussion with your friends in the bar. I think most of the sports betting content, unfortunately, especially now, is picks related, what I would call that hard gambling news, right? Who am I betting on tonight? Sunday Night Football starting in 10 minutes, right? Who am I betting on right now? I'm betting the first half, all these things. So I started at ESPN. I was there for 10 years and was working under Chad Millman, who then went to run the Action Network. And so I was editing his blog and podcast, and that was kind of my introduction to sports betting content in 2010. And so then worked all the way through. We launched ESPN Chalk in 2014, which was the standalone sports betting vertical on ESPN.com that was basically solely related to sports betting. And so I was running the content, hiring writers, doing all of that. And then obviously it kind of was a rocket ship in 2018. I was at the Supreme Court for the hearing. That was an interesting experience in itself. They definitely could have comfier chairs. I'll say that. But it was interesting to see, obviously, the industry beforehand, and then in the 6+ years since then. And so I went to VSiN, the Vegas Stats Information Network. They were acquired by DraftKings. Unfortunately, they had some cost cutting, and I was laid off last year. And after non-compete, started a Substack and have done some other kind of consulting and writing in the space this year as I look for my next position. So that's a short summary of my career, and kind of most of it in sports or sports betting.
Okay, thank you. I think probably most of the people watching are familiar with this topic, so I don't want to ask too many banal questions, but just for the handful that might not be, we should be clear. So sports betting was legal until 2018 when the Supreme Court effectively...
Illegal.
I'm sorry, excuse me, illegal.
Other way, yeah.
Illegal. Sorry, illegal. But with the exception of like horse racing, that has always been legal. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I don't know about always how far back it was, but OTBs and that is a little separate. Sports betting was just in Nevada, which primarily was right. Reno and Vegas, where people could gamble pre-2018. There were some small things in Oregon and Delaware with parlay cards, but the widespread was Nevada pre-2018.
Okay. And so right now it is legal in how many states?
I think we're up to 38. And Missouri just passed, which will be 39. So it's technically legal, but it's not operational yet. That'll be next year. Okay.
All right. Well, people in the audience, please type questions if you have them in the chat, and we will get to them. But I mean, in the meantime, just so we can have an understanding of why we're bothering to talk about this, like, why is it so bad? Can you give a couple of anecdotes or examples of how this has destroyed people's lives?
Was that to me?
Either of you, whichever.
Yeah, Ben, I can take this.
You
Ben.
can start. I'm happy to pipe in with others.
Ben was talking about content and the ethics of soft and hard content. I think the big problem that I don't think the Supreme Court anticipated, and I think Ben would agree with me here, is that the rise of mobile sports betting changed everything. The way anything in your phone. So the phone is obviously we're all everyone listening today, I'm sure most of us are addicted to our phones. Then within that, you have this little app that within one click, you can at any given moment bet on over 100 different things. And within each of the games or events, within each of those, you can be betting real time on point by point on check table tennis is what Harry on the disagreement used. So it's like having a sports betting, like put it this way, up until 2018, you had to travel to Vegas, right? So if it was a bachelor trip, if you wanted to sports bet legally and you didn't want to deal with the mob or some shady, Azerbaijan account, you had to travel to Vegas to place a bet. Now you literally are on your couch, you open your phone, and you have a sports betting casino on your phone, like a full-on casino. So the nature of the product is deeply predatory. And I'll give one anecdote, and I'll use the one that is publicly available because The Athletic did a really excellent piece on a man, and we can link to this. But it goes to show that once you have a mobile product, then you have DraftKings and FanDuel. They have hundreds of engineers, top elite engineers in the country, and their only job is to maximize revenue. And in the world of sports betting, maximizing revenue means making as many people lose as much money as possible. Like it's perfectly adversarial industry. You have to it's obvious, but also like when you think about it, like the way that Meghan, you optimize revenue is like have more people subscribe to your Substack or go to your events. The way that Jason Robbins, the CEO of DraftKings, tells his team to maximize revenue is to have like my brother's buddies like destroy their marriages and lose their kids' college education. That's how they make more money. So obviously, like this Athletic article that we'll link to, there's the story of a guy makes $100K a year, a veteran. He lost $60,000 in 5 months betting. And it's a classic story, and Ben is familiar with it. You start and you think you're pretty good, and you get a little swagger and you win a little. And then all of a sudden you're trying to make up for losses, and you're chasing bets mid-game and things like that. And he lost $60,000 in 5 months. Then he quit. He got help, he got therapy, he was out of the game for weeks. And the the FanDuel algorithm offered him over the next 6 months $7,000 in free bets to come back in to his addiction, right? It lured him in. It's the equivalent, Meghan, you said when we were talking, and I think it's right. It's the equivalent of like Anheuser-Busch finding out an alcoholic that's in AA and putting like a 12 pack in the refrigerator. So
right.
It's a incredibly unethical and predatory industry, and there's all sorts of examples of that happening every day.
Okay, Ben, I want you to jump in, but first, how is this different than just other types of gambling that you can do on your phone? I mean, you could play online poker, you could do all kinds of things. How is this worse?
I think all gambling. Well, Ben, I mean, you can't right now. Like most of the casino games are regulated, and you cannot play them on your phone. So that's one big. Am I right there, Ben? Like that's one.
Yeah. So online casino, or iGaming as they call it, I think is legal in 6 or 7 states, and sports betting is 38. And then poker, for the most part, after Black Friday, which was 20, forget exactly when, but let's say 15 years ago, has taken much more of a back seat. And again, there's just fewer legal states you can play that in. So yeah, there's less of an opportunity for you to play that on your phone specifically.
Yeah. But it also is different because I think there's no culture. Like when you think of boys 15 to 35, right? There's no culture of hanging out and playing some obscure like blackjack app on your phone. Like sports betting has fully infiltrated the culture of young men in a way that most people that are not a young man, 15 to 35-year-old men, have no idea. Like, I had no idea, and I'm not that far removed. And Ben, you can talk about this, but I looked at 3 different friend groups of about a dozen bros, and almost everyone was sports betting. And they were almost all of them were doing it, if not daily, multiple times a day. And within that, there's a bell curve distribution of the harm that is taking place, right? So half of them, and this is the half that I think, Ben tries to reach, are having a good time. And it's like having a glass of wine with a nice meal. It enhances the experience. And that's beautiful. But then for 15 to 20% of them, it's destroying their lives. They are lying to their spouses. They're taking out all sorts of weird credit and destroying their finances. And then for the other 25%, they're sort of on the path to that, right? And it's like, it's a coin flip. So, I think in that sense, there's a much deeper cultural rooting than any of the other things that are available.
Ben, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a small sample size of bros, though probably a representative sample size. I think probably some of those, to me, the numbers are a bit high, but I think in general, a lot of sports betting kind of comes down to what are you trying to get out of it, right? And so I think there's misaligned incentives with a lot of people. A lot of people see somebody bet $10 online, they had a 16-team parlay, and they won $200,000, and they think that can be me, right? And some of the companies back in 2014, 2015 with Daily Fantasy Sports got in trouble for specific advertising like this, which was essentially promoting all these millionaires that were winning. And sure, there were 1 or 2, but the thought was, hey, if I sign up on this app, I can do that too. I think where people get into trouble with sports betting is that exact thing, right? If you look at it as essentially an entertainment cost, right? I go to a movie, I pay $15, that's the transaction. Maybe you get some popcorn, some other things. There's nothing else. You're expecting to be entertained for 2 hours and then you leave. You're not going to feel better or worse. Hopefully the movie was good. With sports betting, potentially you could win money on the other side of that. But it all depends, again, on kind of what you're doing going into it. How much are you betting? How frequently are you betting? How much are you betting relative to your income, relative to how much money you have? Are you using an appropriate bankroll? So, for example, your bankroll, let's say it's $100. That's the total amount. If you lose $100, you're out. You should be betting 1% per bet.
How many?
If your bankroll's $100, you should bet $1 a bet.
How many people are doing that? Even the people having fun. I mean, what percentage of total bettors are betting, have a set aside bankroll and are betting 1% of that? I have my own estimate.
Not many. And I think that's part of what the goal, what I try to do as well. I was in Hoboken today visiting my niece, and the doorman he had Red Zone on, and so I stopped by because I was checking it out. And he was showing me his 8-leg parlay that again had no chance of hitting, and he of course lost on several of the legs. But it's also the way kind of people are betting, and I think that's what Alex rightfully is pushing. Right, is the books know these same game parlays, and parlays are high hold percentage, meaning basically they win a lot more money on the parlays, which is why they're pushing people towards betting those. Unfortunately, it's also for people, if you have these 5 or 6 leg parlays, it's very exciting, right? All of a sudden I hit 3 and now, oh man, I just hit the 4th and everyone's riding together. But for the most part, you're going to lose. And where sports books might win, let's say 5% in a month, they might win 20% on parlays. So it's a massive, massive difference, which obviously is why they want to push them. But it's difficult to, it's not exciting if you're betting, like I said, you're betting $1 each game, right? And you're winning after 20 bets, you're down $2.47. Like, people don't think that's exciting. They might do it for a little while, and then they're going to just start betting $5, $10, $20 parlays, and then they lose their bankroll. So it's a lot about that education. I totally agree with some of the things Harry says. There's definitely issues in the industry. I think there will be more regulation and everything going forward. But my general stance, I think, where Harry and I somewhat agreed on Alex's podcast is sports betting was already happening before 2018 in many, many other states outside of Nevada. It's now at least in a legalized environment. That should be a better thing. And I think due to some of the things Alex is saying with mobile betting and especially some of the VIP programs, it's not necessarily a better thing for bettors in a lot of that way.
Thank you for acknowledging that, Ben. It's been a disaster. I think it's been a disaster. If it right, if you know the things, I bet Ben and I would agree on like 7 things that we could do to quickly implement and make it legal and safe and take advantage of the legalization, which is, you know, that's the beautiful thing about legalizing. You can regulate and you can sort of, you know, put some guardrails in place. But the industry so far has blocked everything. I mean, it's the least regulated industry that exists. Like, you know, all of Elon and Vivek, and they're, you know, trying to get rid of regulation. They don't have to do anything when it comes to sports betting because there's nothing. And this is the one place where actually it would, well, not the one place, but this is a place where I think most people could agree that it would do a ton of good. So.
Okay, we have a comment from Chad, my friend Chad. I've watched UFC. Sorry, this is hard to read the way they have it. I've watched UFC streams from the UK, and it seems huge over there. Every single break and commercial after commercial for sports betting. Oh, sorry. Every single break is commercial after commercial for sports betting, always framed like good, clean fun. Are their laws different there in terms of how they can advertise? Given that this is all online now, it seems like an international problem.
Yeah, well, Ben, you can build on this, but the UK, there's some ties, Meghan, to some of the gender affirming care.
We're not getting into that today.
No, this is outside it, but the UK was a US in some of its.
Oh yeah,
in terms of some of its insights and sort of canary in the coal mine way, and it's the same here. I mean, the UK just in August began requiring operators to run background checks to make sure that people that were betting online in various ways had what they call the wherewithal, the financial means to bet. For anyone who lost more than $700 a month, the UK started regulating. So, you know, I think it is true that it's everywhere, but I think, and I you know, this is not an area of deep expertise, so I'd refer to Ben here, but this is an area where I think we should be looking to the UK, and we should just be implementing what they have implemented, because Ben, like, they were earlier. Like I feel like they have had mobile casino games and mobile betting before we did, and the trends, from what I understand, were fairly horrific. And so they are now like starting to try to backtrack and bring it all together. So again, I think we should be learning from a country like the UK as quickly as we can.
Yeah, I think it's however many years in the future you'd want to put where the UK is where the US will get, right? In terms of stricter advertising and regulations and dealing in some other way with the VIP programs. It's just a much more ingrained, betting is an ingrained way of life in the UK. I think in the same way in the US, people grow up with fantasy football, right? Just everybody's playing fantasy and you root for certain players. That's kind of how people with betting in daily fantasy sports and now in, you know, the NFL and other sports get into prop betting and betting on specific players, because a lot of kids now are fans of players as opposed to necessarily teams, right? They're a LeBron James fan, not necessarily a Lakers fan, because LeBron was just on the Lakers and the Cavs and all these other teams. They just like LeBron. And so in the UK, I think US companies certainly could have looked there and say, hey, where did they go wrong? Let's not make these same mistakes. I would say that hasn't happened. But ultimately, I think a lot of it is, you know, I would say just greed, right? These are companies that they're like cigarettes, right? They weren't going to put advertisements on cigarettes saying, hey, here's a picture of what your lungs might look like, until they were forced to at a certain point, right? And so I think you can certainly debate, you know, the vice it is sports betting versus an entertainment activity versus alcohol versus marijuana versus some of the other, a sin tax, let's say, in terms of those things. But I think, yes, the UK is ahead in some areas, just because it's been so ingrained in sports, and just you go to a soccer match and everybody's betting on it, and it's just kind of what is done. And I think it's much more familiar there. There's all the William Hill, shops on seemingly every corner, and Ladbrokes and Paddy Power and all these different companies. It's just different in the US with DraftKings and FanDuel and ESPN Bet and others.
Okay, well, speaking of those platforms, there was a question earlier. Is Better a legitimate platform? BETR, I think it was.
I'll say this and then kick it to Ben because I have no idea. I do know that Jake Paul tattooed that on his calf. So if that makes, that has nothing to do with how legitimate it is, but it is on Jake Paul's calf, the word.
So Better is BETR, is a sports betting company. Jake Paul is involved in it. Joey Levy and some others who was with Simple Bet before. They're trying to do kind of some micro betting, and I would say appeal to bettors through kind of influencers. I don't think there's that much that's different from necessarily like DraftKings and FanDuel. They haven't gained a ton of market share in the multiple states kind of that they've been in. They tend to point to, out of all operators, they have by far the most social traffic and impressions. I think a lot of that is Jake Paul and not necessarily Better, but yeah, they're definitely legitimate, and obviously have plenty of money behind them. I think Jake Paul is doing just fine. It'll just be a question of how much market share they can compete against, obviously, the big boys in the space.
In terms of market share, Ben, it's FanDuel and DraftKings have 70%, 75% between the two of them. Is that?
It might even be 80. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think then Caesars and BetMGM and then ESPN Bet
right
are kind of the next tier.
So one of the things we spoke about, Alex, when we did my podcast, is just the way that this phenomenon has really sort of alienated people from the actual experience of watching sports and fandom and the camaraderie and just the kind of just old-fashioned social experience of it. Instead of just hanging out with your friends and going to the game or watching the game, everyone's sort of looking at their phone. So I wonder if either of you want to elaborate on that. I mean, we don't necessarily need to shoehorn every topic into the so-called masculinity crisis, but it does seem germane. So I was wondering if one of you wanted to say more about that.
Ben, you go first, and I'll build.
I have so many thoughts on the masculinity crisis. No, I mean, I think as you get kind of closer to Gen Z and younger, right? It's just you grew up with a phone. It's so ingrained, right? Like in college, I think maybe junior year, I had an iPhone. Like it just wasn't, I had the little lollipop. I had a flip phone. Like we didn't have access to YouTube when we were 6 years old and are manipulating a tablet and all these things. So it's such a tough comparison, I think, with kind of different generations. But for sure, everyone is on their phone. I'm sure they're on their phone way too much, both from a just kind of dopamine release and everything else. It can't be good, let alone when you think about your neck and how much you're looking down over the course of a day. But, and also, maybe it's because I'm old. Everything seems very small on most of the phones too. Like I like to read on the computer, a big desktop. But I think for sports and sports betting, the league certainly saw it as a way to enhance the in-game product, right? And a lot of sports betting is legal is now the Knicks are playing the Hawks and the Knicks are up 30 points in the fourth quarter. Well, there's a reason for people to stay because you can bet on the spread, right, for the rest of the game or bet on the total or some other things. And obviously you can do that through your phone. And now there's so many states it's legal. And most of the states that NBA teams play in, outside of Texas, California, Georgia, a couple others, you can do that in the stadium. And so I think they view that as kind of an additive thing. I think it's something that the sports leagues also struggle with. Is the crowd the same if everyone's also on their phone, right? How do you keep people's attention in the crowd, especially in commercial breaks? Everyone, you have 40,000 people in the stadium all on their phone, as opposed to talking about the game or doing anything else. They're probably on their phone checking their fantasy team or potentially putting in a bet or something else. So I'm not sure if there's a great way to solve it outside of, there's certain like self-mandated limits you can have for apps like Twitter. You can say, hey, after half an hour, basically kick me out. But again, much like sports betting and self-exclusion lists, where if I bet too much, I say, hey, don't let me bet, they can do that, but it takes you to take the step to do that. So I don't think, again, that's going to happen very frequently. It's difficult with phones. I think it's just kind of, it's a part of, it's a part of life, and you try and limit it as much as you can. And ultimately, I always look at it as, after this period of time and this activity, kind of like, do I feel better or do I not feel better? I didn't have Instagram for a long time because, to me, everyone who was on Instagram was complaining about Instagram and scrolling and their friend and this and vacation photos they weren't on. To me, it didn't seem like a good activity for me. There wasn't any value. And so I just stayed away. I do have Instagram now, but I'd say I'm on it, 10 minutes a day max.
I think a nice way to think about the FanDuel and DraftKings apps are like Instagram for financial ruin. I really think that is a good analogy, and Ben, we can talk about it because it's the same addictive principles. It's the same sort of core UI UX engineering and all of the psychological sort of algorithms that go in to prey upon your attention in Instagram, but instead they're just being those same exact algorithms are preying upon your like bank account. And so I think it's worth pausing on something Ben said, because it is so profound. The sports leagues and the mobile apps, the sports books, want you to bet in games. And it's not just like bet in games like, on the over under at halftime or something like that. It is what Ben said. It is the Celtics are winning by 30 points with 90 seconds left. Okay, so it's a blowout game, and they want you to bet, are they going to win by more than 32 or less than 32? This is for addicts. There are certain people that are at the game and they're drinking, having fun with their bros, but most people that are betting on like these obscure in-game bets, like it is just so deeply unhealthy. Like their relationship with sports is so far from what like mine was, and I'm sure Ben's was growing up, like cheering for your team. I think the easiest way to think about the shift in terms of sports culture is that there is a whole generation of boys that are now no longer cheering for the team because their dad like took them to that team's game when they were little, or because they grew up, in that area. They just cheer for wherever they put the action. So the relationship to sports fandom is no longer with a team or even with players. For a lot of young boys, it is with wherever the action is. So if I'm in Boston and I have a buddy who bet on like a Minnesota Twins game, who doesn't has zero affiliation with them. He is a Minnesota Twins fan for the next 4 hours. Like
Wow.
that is how fandom is shifting for young people in a pretty fundamental way. Aside from all the obvious fallout of addiction and all of that.
Are they doing it at the actual game? I mean, I have to say, I went to a couple Dodger games this summer, and I didn't really see people looking at their phones too much. I mean, I'm sure they were, but do you find that they're doing this in the stadiums actually?
They have kiosks, right, Ben? That like they set up little areas where you can go do it, and obviously can do it on your phone anytime.
Yeah, so I think it varies. They do have kiosks. I think for the most part in stadiums, those are to sign up for apps. I don't think you can actually necessarily bet on those. That could have changed in the last couple of years, but everyone has a phone. I'm also depending if you're at the Dodgers game, there is no sports betting in California, so that legally.
Oh,
so that also
well, that answers
could
that.
be
Okay.
could be part of it. To Alex's point, I think a lot of this is, and a difference too with the UK, the vast majority of sports betting handle and sports betting wagers in the US are pre-game, meaning they're before the game. The vast majority of people are not there, like Alex is saying, betting on every single thing.
You have a problem.
In the UK.
Yeah. You have a problem with that, yeah.
Okay, we have.
I wouldn't say a problem, and I'll just finish by saying in the UK it's kind of the opposite because of soccer is the most popular sport and it's a great in-game wagering sport. So over 50% of the bets and handle in the UK is placed in-game. It's people going to the game, seeing how it is, and betting within the game. So it's an option for people at games in a way it wasn't certainly pre-legalization. But if there's 30,000 people at a game, I would guess there's under 1,000, if that, probably in the hundreds, who are actually live betting, especially more than one live bet during those games. Certainly it's an option, and certainly, again, an option, as Alex said, sometimes too many options leads to financial ruin, but I don't think that's prevalent kind of in the same way that, no one's watching the game because everybody's betting every 2 seconds.
Right.
Okay. We have a question from MKJ. What is the actual business model for these platforms? Do they take a flat percentage of each pot, or are some types of bets more skewed than others due to the platform taking out a larger percentage? If the platform takes nothing out of the pot, then the expected value of betting would presumably be neutral.
Okay.
You want me to take this?
Why don't I give the high level and then you can clean up whatever I say.
Sure.
But I think it's fairly simple, and I think people, there are different models when you're betting and how the house makes money, right? And so if you're playing poker is a game where you're playing against the other players, and then the house takes what is called a rake, or what is a vig, which is a percentage of the total betting that is taking place. But ultimately, it's not adversarial because if I'm losing to some other poker player. In the sports betting world, it is the business model is fundamentally adversarial. They take, and they have a little vig or rake that they take, but essentially they take everything that someone lost, all of the global lost money by bettors, and then they subtract from that whoever won, the amount of winning, and their revenue is the net losses. That is when DraftKings is reporting its $1 billion in revenue, that is the college funds of your neighbors. It is my friend's mortgage on his house. That is their revenue. It is the individual losses. That is their business model. It's very simple. Okay, Ben, what'd I get wrong?
I don't think anything wrong. I think, I don't think everyone is gambling away their college funds unless they're doing that $10 or $20 at a time. But yes, there are certainly some people who are doing that. In essence, most of the bets are, let's say, a -110 line, which would mean that if I bet $10, then I win $9.09 back, right? I don't win $10. So when you win, the book is keeping that difference. And if you lose, you just lose. A lot of the reasons, I guess, I prefer sports betting than, let's say, daily fantasy sports and other things is because in early DFS, I was playing against somebody else. It was supposed to be an even match, and they were actually putting in 1,000 lineups, and I was putting in one. I had no chance of winning. And obviously, if they win, I lose. That's it. In sports betting, everyone can win. If 99% of the bets were on the Bills today, and the Bills won by 10, then guess what? Everybody wins, except for the 1% who bet on the Lions. It's not peer-to-peer. It's against the house. Now, the house is generally going to win. That's why the businesses are. But everybody can win, and it's the same way. If you bet the Bills at -2.5 and -3 and -3.5 and -4, and they win by 10, everybody who bet the Bills wins at every single number. So there are those possibilities. In general, with these same game parlays, what the books tend to do is a parlay basically means multiple things have to happen in order for you to win. And so if you have 5 things that come together and you bet $10, maybe you win $500, but all 5 of those things have to happen. If 4 of them happen, 1 doesn't, you lose. If you put all those together, the actual odds of it happening may be 500 to 1. The book may be giving you 250 to 1, right? And so they're not giving necessarily all those odds. And unless you're a mathematician or someone with a model, you don't know how to calculate what the true odds of that bet that you are making. You're just saying, I like Josh Allen to throw a touchdown, and I like this, and I like this, and I'm going to stack them all together. You have no idea what the odds of those 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 things are together. And so that's a lot of the difference in how the books also are making those money with same game parlays, is that you don't actually know the true odds basically that you're betting on.
Okay.
Can I ask Ben just a very quick follow on, and then just what percentage, Ben, of amateurs, like people that aren't running big models and 10,000 lines of code, over the course of their lifetime or over the course of 5 years, do you think they end up winning significantly?
Under 10%, probably
right.
under
Okay.
5%.
Exactly, 5%, right? So 90 plus percent of people that are engaging in sports betting are going to lose. And we can talk more about that if people are interested. And then it's just a question of how much and in what way, and like what it's going to do on their marriage and their finances and their, everything else. And I think people don't understand that it is that high because it is just built. It is built in the way you were talking about it, in a totally asymmetric way.
And look, it's like the psychology of Vegas, right? You go to Vegas, everybody goes to Vegas, and at some point, hopefully, on the trip, you're up, right? You're there Friday to Sunday, you're up Friday night, you're up $200. You don't stop, right? You could, but you have the rest of the weekend. So sports betting is similar in that, right? If you did hit one giant parlay or a couple of bets and you were up $50, you could certainly, withdraw your money. It's just unlikely you're going to do that because either A, you feel like, hey, I know something, I can make more money, or it's not financially an issue for you to do that. But the likelihood is that, yes, you're probably going to keep playing. You don't have an edge, and you're probably going to end up in the losing as opposed to winning.
And one thing that's worth noting, we didn't talk about this, Meghan, because I talked to someone else and they shared it with me. It really is a uniquely silent addiction for a number of reasons. Because again, 90 to 95% of people are losing money, and many of that denominator, there's some percentage that is very significant. But people lie about it, right? I mean, people it's very easy. No one knows what you're making. There's a lot of pride. There's a lot of male pride. So first off, it's very hard to know because people lie about it. It's also hard to know because there's no hangovers. There's no signs of addiction. You're not there's no way to know. And so I think for the most part, you have this, and this is where the real sort of building epidemic is coming. You have this entire sort of generation of young boys that are sort of hiding it, and there's no real way to tell unless you're all up in their finances. And then by the time it comes out, it's too late. You're destroyed. And that's why, gambling in general has the highest suicide rate. And, anyway, that's where the concern comes from. And I will say one other thing that was interesting when talking to a couple other people, that relates to the silence, is that other addictions right now, if you have an alcohol addiction or a drug addiction, there's actually a fair amount of support in the culture for, you've talked a lot about this, Meghan, and just being there for people with all sorts of issues.
Yeah, there's a whole vocabulary around it. There's a whole subculture, recovery and addiction. And
there's identity, positive identities that you can. I'm not weighing in on any of this. I'm just, but
right.
Sports betting doesn't have that, right? Sports betting is the most weirdly stigmatized addiction because it's seen as a broy, is a broy thing. Not to bring in the culture war, but
please.
Yeah, I do think that it's weirdly stigmatized, right? When you think of it's easy to drop empathy for someone struggling with a drug addiction or an opioid addiction, but it's much harder just for many people, especially in certain places, to draw up empathy for like a bro that, you know, spent $25K on like bad NFL bets, like to, you know, that he gave to Roger Goodell and other people. It's a weird,
Right.
there's a weird cultural thing.
I mean, are we seeing a rise in people going to GA, Gamblers Anonymous, with a kind of subset of them in there because of sports betting? I mean, I don't know if you know the answer.
The Athletic, I really recommend that. The Athletic interviewed Gamblers Anonymous, their national like spokesperson, and they said, I mean, this was like to me one of the most profound things. They said that the median age of people attending Gamblers Anonymous has dropped like by 20 years, and they're seeing 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, high school kids, all sports betting. So it used to be Gamblers Anonymous was like men in their 60s and 70s that were blackjack addicts or the track, and now you're seeing people like honestly that look like me and Ben, and that's becoming the norm because of sports betting. I mean, it's pathetic.
How does it, sorry, this is a really like obvious question, or maybe not. How does a 14-year-old do this? Like, he doesn't have a credit card. They're using their parents' credit cards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay.
Super easy. Super easy.
Okay. Chad has another question. Curious about the rise of poly market and politics betting, and such. Were these platforms, how are these platforms situated in the conversation, or are they, for example, betting on the election or whether Trump's nominees will be approved, etc.? Wow, I don't know anything about this. Do you?
I know a little, Ben, but Ben probably knows more.
Yeah, I mean, I probably should know more than I do. Polymarket and a couple of others were really in the news. Obviously, this election cycle, political betting in the U.S. had been illegal outside of, I think, outside of like for about 14 days in West Virginia about 4 years ago. And so some of these other sites, which are either offshore or based in Europe or somewhere else, allow people to, I think Polymarket's peer-to-peer, but I'd have to check. But basically, you're entering kind of into a contract, and you are wagering on whether Donald Trump will, be the president potentially, or will be the next president, or will they win a specific state, or all these other things. So much like a sports book would give you access to not only Sunday Night Football and the Packers and Seahawks and the very basic markets, but also all these derivative markets. I think I honestly forget what happened with the case. I think there was a case with the FTC with Polymarket, and but I think it's going to continue to be a thing that's around, because whether or not it's a good thing is another debate. I think certainly when you look at the betting markets had Trump as a much bigger favorite, and so I think that's what a lot of people were pointing to. And a lot of people are also pointing back and saying, well, that could be his donors and all this. But there were billions of dollars wagered in Polymarket on the election. It was a massive, massive amount of money. And this was offered in Betfair overseas and other places. But it was just, it was something that really came up this election cycle, and using Polymarket and a couple other sites that their names are escaping me. But it was something where you could check daily and see kind of, where the odds are in this race, and they drastically shift in a way that sports betting doesn't typically in kind of a normal game. So there was a lot of opportunity for people. There was a point, I think, after the first debate where Trump was an underdog, right? And so if you then bet a lot of money on Trump, you're going to potentially win a lot of money. So I think political betting is a whole different can of worms than sports betting for a whole lot of reasons. I'm definitely not a person who's like, hey, every single thing we should be allowed to bet on it. And I think politics falls into definitely that gray area, just for me. But there's a lot of interest out there, clearly from consumers, given the handle in the last election.
It's also worth noting that it's just the betting mechanics are totally different than the sports betting mobile apps, right? There's no parlays, there's no VIP hosts that are, know when you get your paycheck and know when you're driving by like a Buffalo Wild Wings to trigger you and try to entice you. There's no free money being given to addicts. They are in therapy trying to quit. So I think it's super interesting because a lot of people cite it, and I think it has a decent track record as the best approximation of what is true on any given prediction, because people have to actually put up real money, and you sort of, cuts through a lot of the noise. But anyway.
Interesting. Okay. All right, we got about 9 minutes left, so ask your questions if you have them. Who owns these companies? Who is profiting from all of this?
DraftKings is a public company. It's got a $16 billion market cap. It was funded. It's based here in Boston. My previous company, we had an investor, General Catalyst. That was I think they put $100K into my company. They put, a lot more into DraftKings, but they're one of the funders. So it's kind of the classic American startup. FanDuel, Ben, it's a British company.
It's owned by Flutter.
Yeah. I know less about it's an amazing name. What's the name of it?
Flutter.
Yeah,
Fluttered? Another Flutter. Like wings fluttering.
Oh, Flutter.
Flutter. Yeah.
But after they commit suicide, they flutter up to heaven or.
That's so British.
Yeah.
Clever. Okay, I like that. Okay, I think we sort of covered this. What's the stats on actual sports addiction per casual bettors or versus casual bettors? I mean, I don't know if this is knowable.
This would be the study. There's been some good RCTs that have come out. I mean, this would be whatever combination of social science, like anthropology and economics or social science. This is the most important question. What is the distribution of people that start sports betting? Like, what is the distribution of outcomes, right? Is it 10% that become deeply addicted and 1% that commit suicide? Or is it 2% that commit suicide and 18% that become deeply addicted, and every sort of shade in between? I think that no one knows, but Ben and I went through I gave my like back of the envelope, and Ben thought it was too aggressive. But I said 50% are in some realm of health and percent are in the realm of unhealth, and I think 10 to 15% are quite serious, and I think the other 35% are on the verge of being quite serious. That's my very unscientific distribution.
Yeah, I think part of it is much like a high schooler who is drinking, right? You're probably not going to admit to doing it if it's something that's not legal. Where now sports betting is legal in all these states, you theoretically could have more data, but to Alex's point, you could be embarrassed. You might not want to admit how much money you have. So I think some of that is difficult to get those numbers. There are going to be, I don't want to be the person saying like, of course the numbers are going to be higher, but also, of course the numbers are going to be higher. It's a little bit like every Super Bowl is now the most bet Super Bowl at Sportsbook X, because now they're in 20 states as opposed to being legal in 15 states. So I do think there is some of that. That doesn't mean there isn't an issue that's underlying that in terms of levels of addiction and all that. But I would be surprised, I guess, with more states and more sports books and more overall people legally betting if the numbers weren't higher of people calling the problem gambling.
Another way to think about it is every time, Kevin Hart jumps up on a couch, or the Manning brothers, do whatever they're doing, or Bill Simmons plugs some FanDuel 30 for 30 that I heard this morning, they are going to bring 100 new bettors in, and they're going to bring whatever the percentage is, 10 new young human beings, probably boys, are going to have their lives destroyed because of those advertisements. That's just the math. That is the math. And these people seemingly, I'm sure they're all great people. I have I don't question.
I'm sure some of them are very fine people.
Yeah, I'm sure there's fine people on all sides of this issue, but it's just true. And someone at some point needs to step up and speak out for regulation. Like it's very straightforward and it's nonpartisan.
And I will say as well, I think on Tuesday, I will be on vacation, so I'm not sure if I'll be covering it too closely, but I believe there's a congressional hearing on something relating to sports betting and some potential regulation or that. So, when Adam Silver wrote his op-ed in 2014 in the New York Times, he was calling for sports betting to be brought, as he said, kind of into the sunlight and out of the darkness with federal legislation. And that's part of the issues with the state by state regulation is you have this real patchwork of New York is 51% tax rate, and this state's 10%, and this state is 21, and this state has mobile, this state doesn't, etc. Ultimately, these are public companies, and essentially removing the moral issues, which is a big thing to remove. You're essentially someone is asking them to make less money, right? Is kind of what it comes down to,
Totally.
because that's essentially what it is. And morally, I 100% agree. But it is kind of, I always use kind of a restaurant analogy or something else. Like if somebody is all you can eat and it's $20 and they're only eating $5 worth of food, you could tell them they probably just need to order the $5 worth. But if they're paying every $20, like you're making more money off of them. There's obviously a lot more societal harms than that. That boils it down very simply, but ultimately that's kind of what it is. There is no oversight. There's no federal oversight. There's no FTC like for the stock market. Someone has to make the companies and say, you can't do this with VIP programs. You can't have this, in different states, they have raised the tax rate, which obviously led to some interesting things in Illinois for DraftKings. But ultimately, that's what it is. Someone has to tell the companies you have to make less money.
It needs to be federal regulation. And Adam Silver, the reason that he's not calling for this obvious ethical thing is he's too busy thinking about what social justice terms to put on the players' jerseys. That's where all of his ethical instincts are focused on, instead of the massive, clearly looming crisis that he has contributed to. I think it's gross.
All right, we have 2 minutes left. Is there anything else you want to add? I'm also just curious what the response was to your podcast, your conversation on the disagreement.
Oh, well, it was great. It was excellent. I think it was one of the most, there's various metrics, but one is like how many texts do I get about the various episodes, and I think it was like in our top 10% most, people reaching out to me. I think, Meghan, the experience you talked about having where people, and the experience I had up until I started doing research, it's just, if you're not in the 15 to 35 male demographic, there's a good chance you have no idea what's going on. And so I think a lot of that just sort of like shock and dismay. And, a lot of questions about what to do. I do think there are still 11 states that have not decided. So I think if you are in those 11 states, I spoke to an addict, like he's not a gambling addict, but he's, had an unhealthy relationship at times. And he said one of the things that he's so grateful he wakes up every morning is grateful that he lives in California. He can't do it.
Might be the only reason left.
Right. I mean, seriously, for him, he's so thankful. So if you're in those 11 states, don't do it unless there's really comprehensive federal regulation.
All right, Ben, any final thoughts?
I think for me, it all kind of comes back to, I think it's something that has it rolled out perfectly. Of course not. Since 2018, I think the large casinos probably thought that their brand names would carry more weight. And I think that certain companies like DraftKings and FanDuel had better technology, and that's why, and they had all of these databases from Daily Fantasy Sports in 2014, 2015, and they had this basically a number of people they could immediately market to, and that's why they have this market share. I do think there'll be more regulation. I do think that kind of people can have a healthy relationship with sports betting. And I do think there are people who just shouldn't be doing it. And I think ultimately an issue that companies will get to the bottom of at some point is that it's hard to figure out where that line between really great customer and problem gambler is. And in the distance, where is that crossing? And right now, I think for the most part, it's good customer. And until there's kind of some roadblocks for some of the companies, that's probably going to be, the way that it goes. What I try to do with my Substack is offer as much kind of advice and picks. Everyone wants picks, right? They're still going to be doing it, but showing, hey, here's, like I said with that boring 1% bankroll, like here's how to do it. If you do have an issue, there have been people who have canceled my Substack and said, hey, I just, I lost some money in my account, gonna, not bet for a while. I said, that's great. I didn't say, hey, and now get a 50% discount for next month, right? There's no upsell there.
You didn't
exactly
send VIP to their house and
no, that's a good decision by them, and everyone should be free to do what they want. And I agree with Alex. I definitely think the big problem is that the vast majority of the revenue from a lot of the books is, let's say, by 10 to 15% of the bettors betting and losing the most. The vast majority of the curve are people who are winning a little, some very few winning a lot, and most losing a little or losing.
But the revenue, sorry, I know we got to go, but this is important. The vast majority of the revenue, Ben, is coming from people that are unhealthy, right? It's not whatever the $1 billion that DraftKings did this year. It's not that $1 billion is not primarily coming from people that are betting like me once a month or twice a month, $100. Like the relationship between their core business model and unhealthy to addicted behavior is intimate, and we need to find that out because we don't know. But what we do know, when New Jersey released the stats, that 5% of bettors accounted for 70% of sports betting revenue. So you can read between the lines. Like, I think if you're looking at total bettors, yes, the majority are, having a good time and doing it the way I do. When you're looking at their business model, the vast majority, and again, there's no way to confirm this because they'll never tell us because they know the answer. The vast majority of the revenue is coming from people on some spectrum of unhealth. And that's an important distinction.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you both so much. Remind people quickly what your Substacks are so they can subscribe if they're not already. Your Alex
Grodd, The Disagreement. Check us out. And thank you, Meghan, for having me.
Okay, Ben, what's your Substack?
Yeah. Mine is the very appropriately Ben Fawkes' sports betting Substack.
Okay.
Very clever name.
I'm the Unspeakable Podcast. For those of you who are just finding me here, I'm going to post a recording of this conversation for paying subscribers on my Substack. So if you came in late and you want to hear it, you can join our community over there. And thank you both so much. It's a great conversation. Maybe we'll take it up again sometime. But happy holidays. And don't be careful out there.
Yeah.
Put your phone away.
Be safe.
Okay. Bye-bye.